Black tulip. Do they really exist? I'm sure a lot of you would have came across some black tulips during spring, or at least came across some Google images showing you this fascinating looking black tulip flower. So let's find out more as I show you how to paint them. So hello and welcome to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. So basically there is no black colored tulip naturally. It is just that naturally they are very deep velvety shade, as in very dark violet, burgundy or even maroon makes them appear like black for the bare eyes or your naked eyes. As you observe closely, you will notice all those deep red hues or violet and burgundy, especially under very bright sunlight. So I was doing some color studies in order to achieve this black tulip shade, and just sharing here how I arrived at all these dark shades by mixing several basic colors. For example, I have written here 2 or 3 colors that I've mixed to arrive at these shades, and some of it I have used underpainting technique. Though the colors appear way much lighter as they have dried, of course in watercolor you will have to paint in layers in order to darken them gradually. I have even made a sample painting of a tulip using some of these shades here. However, after making this tulip painting, I noticed that it looks a bit dull as it's missing some vibrancy. So I thought I will kickstart using an underpainting technique. As you'd see, the corner of the tulip where I have used a deep blue shade as an underpainting, it appears more brighter and vibrant. So let's start painting the black tulip. As usual, my favorite watercolor paper, Canson XL cold press 300 grams per square meter and in size A5. Alright, to kickstart, I'm going to paint this using the underpainting technique as I mentioned earlier in this video, as how I'm showing this particular tulip motif, followed by one of these color mixes that I've done during my color study. So I'll be using the wet on dry technique. So basically it's wet paint on dry paper, and to kickstart, as I said, underpainting using sapphire blue shade. You can also use ultramarine, but make sure it is a deep blue shade. So using a good ratio of paint mix against water, I'm just trying to paint the main head. You don't want a very watery paint mix because the blue shade from the underpainting should have an impact on the second layer of your painting. So don't make it too watery. As you can see here, the blue shade is quite strong, and I'm going to paint each and every petal, just showing you here how to paint those separate petals. Though it doesn't really matter, you can one shot make a big head of the tulip. I'm just trying to assist you with the visualization process on how to paint the tulip step by step or petal by petal, because often we think it's just one stroke to paint a tulip's head or tulip's petal. However, if you do it gradually, you will get the different perspective of how the tulip head looks like. I'm not sure how to explain this in a very simple manner. In other words, you don't want your tulip flower to look extremely flat. So if you do it petal by petal, you would likely achieve the 3-dimensional look of it. As I complete the basic painting of this tulip, you will notice there are 6 petals of the tulip, even though scientifically it is actually 3 petals and 3 sepals, which are all symmetrical in shape. So in the middle part of the flower, I am just trying to lift out some pigment using a dry paper towel because I need to paint the pistil part, which is lighter in shade. Alright, as we wait for the flower painting to dry, you can start painting the stem of the tulip. I am using olive green yellowish shade over here by Schminker. You can use any green shade of your choice, as in sap green, but make sure it is lighter in shade. Once again, I'm painting this using the wet on dry technique. So just use the round brush to make a nice vertical line, and also extending the same color to paint the leaves of the tulip. So in order to achieve a nice brush stroke, don't be afraid to press the entire bristle on your paper as you move it towards the tip of the leaf. Just lift your bristle whereby the tip ends the top of the leaf painting. So you'll arrive at a very narrow or sharp edge of the leaf painting. Next, we are going to proceed to paint the second layer, and in order to do that, the first layer should have dried. So please make sure your painting is already dry. And the second paint shade that I'm using here is permanent carmine. You can use crimson as well. I'm going to paint this using the wet on dry technique as well, which is why this layer, the first layer, has to be dry. So as I paint the permanent carmine over the blue layer tulip motif, you will see an instant change of the tulip's color. You can slightly notice that purplish shade. This is why underpainting helps to transform your painting. Though you can achieve a purple shade by painting something using a ready-made violet, yet it won't be the same as underpainting, because underpainting gives a different perspective. If you use just a solo color, you will have to keep repainting them and yet not achieving that different perspective that you're looking for in a painting. So you can keep repainting these petals using the permanent carmine or your crimson if you think it is necessary, like what I'm doing over here. I just felt that I needed more of that reddish hue, especially on the front part of the flower compared to the petals at the back. And as I complete painting the remaining petals, I am being mindful with the amount of paint that I'm applying over here. I wanted some contrast between these petals so that they all don't look the same. Therefore, I'm leaving some blue spaces. You can do this by just applying a little bit of your red paint and giving them some light washes with a clean damp brush. Moving on, you have to paint the second layer of the stem and leaves. So over here I am mixing olive green, a deeper hue one, versus the one with the yellowish hint that I used as the first layer. So this appears much darker. And as usual, I'm painting this using the wet on dry technique. So basically this entire painting is created using the wet on dry technique. And as you notice, I'm just applying it part by part, whereby after applying paint, I am giving them light washes with a clean damp brush. So as I paint using this particular brush, I'm keeping another brush handy, which is a clean damp brush, to give them some light washes, as you can see what I'm doing over here. So this method basically ensures you to paint a natural element, as in leaves, that do not have uniform color. Basically, you know, there are mixes of hues, as in that varies from yellow to green or even blue. So this technique helps you to achieve that while also creating a perspective of light and dark areas. So the darker areas actually represent the areas that are secluded from natural light, while the lighter ones reveals that it has more light source. As in this case, you can imagine that the lighter part of the leaves are the folded edge of a tulip's leaf, or even a shadow on the bottom part of the leaves. So it's all in your imagination how to create this perspective by applying these techniques. and at the same time making your painting vibrant. So remember the middle part of the flower, which I saved for the pistil. So I am just adding in some yellow paint. I mixed some lemon yellow with a hint of Indian yellow, just painting that into the middle part of the flower. So here comes layer number 3, which has the ultimate effect on this entire painting. So for this layer I have decided to use violet and sapphire from the color study that I did earlier and showed in this video. So I'm making a good mix of violet from Schminker and sapphire until I reach that color consistency that I really prefer. As you can see on the screen here, it looks very deep violet. I'm going to paint this using the wet on dry technique onto the flower as usual, just like how I did for the second layer with the permanent carmine. And as I mentioned earlier, with the second layer painting, I am being very mindful with my brush strokes, not to just paint all of them with flat washes. So you would notice that I am painting them part by part, just to keep in mind that I need to focus on the darker areas and lighter areas so that the entire tulip painting doesn't appear flat. As I apply the paint, I am also leaving some small gaps in between. As you can see, the small gap over here on this petal to create an impression of a folded petal. So the lighter color from the earlier layers appear as a 3D effect as you paint the other parts in a darker paint. So this is what we benefit from painting in layers. So just apply your brush strokes in a very minimal manner, and then you can give them some light washes with a clean damp brush, like what I'm doing over here, in order to achieve the best look on your painting instead of one flat brush stroke. Extending the same paint mix onto the front petals, and keep in mind that this is the best time to start adjusting the outlines of your painting subject, since this is going to be one of the last layers. So try to reshape the petals. As I complete painting all these petals with this last layer of paint, you notice that the entire tulip has now transformed from a plain blue shade tulip into the deep velvety violet tulip that resembles the black tulip. Don't you agree? So as I have completed the main layers of this painting, the next step will be to do the finishing touches, and I'm going to use a mix of sapphire and a hint of indigo in order to arrive at a very deep colored hint close to a purplish gray. As you can see from the screen, I'm using a micro brush to paint in these fine details. If you don't have indigo, you can use the same ultramarine blue, because as you mix it with the sapphire, you will arrive at a similar shade. So the micro brush helps me to paint the anthers of the tulip flower. There should be about 6 anthers, And once done with the underpainting, I'm going to extend the same color onto other parts of the tulip painting in order to create more intense look, as in darkening some part on the lip of the petals and also at the bottom part of the petals, while creating some fine-tuned detail as in veins on the flower petals, like how you would notice on a flower petal or leaves. And of course, the best way to achieve this effect would be to use a micro brush like what I'm using over here, or a rigger and script brush would be helpful as well. So I have mixed more of the indigo paint into the paint mix in order to create some more contrast onto these few petals at the back. Alright, done with the tulip painting. I'm going to paint the background, and for the first time in this entire painting I'm going to use the wet on wet technique. So as you can see here, I'm pre-wetting the paper with some clean water, but I'm doing it part by part. And I've decided to paint the background with a cool grey tone. So I am mixing a little bit of burnt sienna with a hint of sapphire and sapphire blue shade. You can use your ultramarine. So mix these two colors with a little hint of sapphire in order to arrive at this shade, and just dropping in onto the pre-wet areas. So keep repeating this process part by part. I prefer to do this part by part because we already have a finished painting motif or subject on the paper. So you want to be very careful with the paint that you're going to apply. You don't want them to bleed onto the finished painting, because this is not an empty paper where you're going to kickstart painting sky or a field using a wet on wet technique, which is why I prefer to do it part by part. You can have some variations in your color coordination as you gradually paint the background by increasing certain pigment ratio in the color mix, the earlier color mix. So it's all up to you. I like to have these variations. It makes the painting look more interesting. Some paint spatters to finish off this painting, and a little bit of water spritz to create some extra effect. Alright, some final touches. I promise this is the final step to this entire painting, but if you don't prefer to do so, you can skip this step. So basically I am just creating some light highlights using a pastel pencil. So I'm using pink pastel from Faber-Castell and in white shade, and just lightly applying that, doing some scribbles of highlights, especially onto the lip of the petal and the dark colored anthers. You may also use gouache paints and even acrylics. Lately I would prefer to use acrylic, though I use gouache, white gouache paint mostly in my paintings, but I have decided to move to acrylic simply because the gouache paints tend to dry very quickly. I mean, maintaining the gouache paints a bit difficult, which is why I thought acrylics and pastel pencils do the best trick. Ta-da! The painting is complete. Here it is, the so-called black tulip. So if you liked my tips in this painting and you enjoyed this video, then do hit the like and share button and subscribe to my channel. Thank you for your support. See you in another exciting video. Bye.